Continuing Chapter 6 of Part 7. There was nothing in the whole character or life of Jesus which Judas could recollect as being any mitigation of the offense of betraying him. If Jesus had ever done a wrong or spoken a word which could warrant the suspicion that he might in some way be injurious to the people, Judas would have employed it as an argument to justify himself to himself. But the life of Jesus was faultless, even Judas being judge. He probably felt that this death was to be a martyrdom so conspicuous that it would be seen by far-off generations, and that his own name would be taught to the children of men from age to age as the synonym of treachery. It was too much for him. He had 2 days and nights of intensest anxiety. He gave way under it all. He rushed into the midst of the cruel churchmen, now ready to despise their base instrument, seeing that they had gained their end. They were probably arranging for the crucifixion in the same chamber in which he had first met them. When the plan for designating and arresting Jesus was concocted, how gladly they received a recreant disciple of Jesus in the time of their political perplexity, and how courteous they were to him so long as they hoped to get anything out of him, and how glumly they met him when he came back, corroded with remorse. He acknowledged his guilt, hoping somehow, vaguely, that it would cover the case and avert the fate of Jesus. He shrieked in their hearing, "I have sinned, in that I have betrayed innocent blood." He seemed to think that his confession might convince them that the whole proceeding was wrong, and that they would probably take measures to secure a reversal of the sentence, which, perceived Pilate, would be most ready to grant. But he did not understand the men in whose service he had enlisted. Their cold reply was it that to us? Do you see to it? It was couched in curter words than the English can well put it. What to us? You see. They were not seeking justice and judgment. He was a fool if he thought so. They wanted to kill a man who was in their way. That was all. His being innocent or guilty was nothing. They had needed Judas as a tool. That was all. They had used him and now flung him away. His guilty solitude was thus manifested to Judas. God and man, church and state, seemed turning against him. He went into the temple, which was now deserted. The priests were away, and the worshippers. The fate of the Galilean prophet kept all Jerusalem intent and absorbed. His dread loneliness came down on the betrayer like a crushing despair. He walked into the holy place, where none but the priests should go. He was alone with the great God, but lost to all distinctions between sacred and profane. Well, one of the goals of the spiritual life is to not have a profane life. Everything you do and not do is connected to that consciousness. He was desolate, darkened, and doomed. The bag with the 30 pieces of silver was in his hand. He flung it down in the sanctuary, flung away the remembrancer of his guilty error, flung down for the priests to gaze upon, the proof of the utter ungodliness of prescriptive churchism. Then he rushed out to some desert place, and all shattered, the wretched man met a clouded fate, the record of which, by the biographers of Jesus, only serves to confound our speculations as to the precise mode of his death. His life went out in a tumultuous, nameless anguish and horror. In the gallery of the apostolic portraits, a rumpled black cloth falls down over the face of Judas. And of course, black was a wealthy color too, but that's not what they're getting at. And they're not getting into the ideas of altar cloths and stuff either. When the ecclesiastics learned that the money was in the temple, the scrupulous murderers were sorely perplexed. The killing of Jesus was not so much matter for their consciences, but here was a question for careful ritualists to study. Here was money, which it would not be correct to waste, and which by certain interpretations of the law could not be put directly to the purposes of the sanctuary. They devised a method. There was a piece of ground of little importance, having been spoiled for cultivation by the potteries adjoining the hill of evil counsel, on which Caiaphas had a country seat, in which it is said that the death of Jesus had been resolved upon. This they bought with the money Judas returned, and named it Akeldama, and dedicated it to the interment of strangers. The ma is blood, right? That is of such as became proselytes to Judaism, for they were too scrupulous to mingle the dust of believers who were only converts with that of the sons of Abraham. Well, see, that is what made Judaism versus the earlier generations, is that the earlier generations, they could have converts, and it didn't matter what ancestry you were. And then it became not only a racial thing, but a tribal thing. But that's where the false ancestry comes in, is because people who have no Semitic ancestry are claiming to be Semites because they're Jews. And 90% in some studies, 95% in others, and a range in between, indicates that no Semitic ancestry whatsoever. Among them, I'm talking like a few thousand years back, that sort of thing. Section 9, going to Calvary. And I mean, in comparison to any other person around, at the very least. After other mockings, they took the robe from Jesus and replaced his own garments and led him away to crucify him. It was a part of the punishment that the convicted person should bear his own cross. Jesus was no exception. The cross was not that huge combination of timber usually imagined and put into pictures. A man of ordinary strength would have little difficulty in carrying it, but Jesus had passed through so much anguish of mind and torture of body that his strength failed him. Well, an ordinary man dragging around a couple beams, I'm not sure that it's so easy for people, right? Maybe back in the 1800s, though. He does not appear to it still would have been difficult, but it would have been done. He does not appear to have been a person of prodigious powers of endurance, but rather a man of delicate organization. When he fell under the cross, the procession met a man coming from the country. It was odd that he should be moving in a contrary way when all the people had been profoundly interested in the tragic affair and were pouring along the streets to see what might be its issue. It happened at the junction needed. The Roman and Jew equally were too proud to do this menial and degrading service. And this man, whose name was Simon, came from Cyrene in African Libya, where many Jews resided, who supported a synagogue in Jerusalem. Whether he had come to Jerusalem to the festival or had lately resided there, we cannot tell. It is not probable that he was a disciple of Jesus, but it is not improbable that, coming suddenly upon this procession and seeing 3 men bearing their own crosses, and one paler and more delicate than the others, lying prone beneath a load he had not the strength to carry, Simon should have uttered some exclamation of natural pity. It was enough to suggest and warrant a military impressment. They made him bear the cross of Jesus. Well, frailer because of what he'd been through, but whether we're talking Barabbas here or we're talking any of the others that were, basically poor hand laborers, perhaps the guys next to them were strong, perhaps their company was stronger or something than he was, but not, it wouldn't have been a weakling, right? Because that's sort of the ideal of Jesus that they tend to portray, isn't it? The artists have generally misled us as to the appearance of one crucified and the structure of the cross. It is not known how early the mode of capital punishment by crucifixion was adopted, because it goes back so many thousand years, but traces of the cross have been found among the Scythians, Persians, Egyptians, Carthaginians, Greeks, and Romans. It goes back even further than that. The Scythians had civilization hundreds of thousands of years ago, so maybe it started with them. It was not a Hebrew mode. The corpse of a criminal who had been executed might be hung upon a tree, but even then it was not permitted to remain all night. Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. Jesus suffered the punishment dealt by Romans to slaves who had been convicted of a capital offense. There were three kinds of crosses: the crux decusata, the X cross, the crux commissa, the crux commissa, the uppercase T cross, and the crux immissa, the lowercase t cross. The cross on which Jesus died is represented by tradition to have been the crux immissa. The upright piece was made just long enough to hold the body a few inches from the ground and to be sufficiently in the ground to support itself and its burden. There was no support for the feet, as the painters now make in the pictures, but on the upright part was a projection or seat on which the weight of the body rested. It would have torn the hands and feet fearfully if the whole weight of the body had depended, as Jeremy Taylor says, on 4 great wounds. After Jesus had been relieved of the burden of the cross by Simon the Cyrenian, the procession moved forward. It was the custom for the heralds to carry the accusation of each convict before him, written on a tablet, whitened with gypsum. Some such epigraph, we suppose, was carried before Jesus, as it was afterwards nailed to the cross. The procession grew as it proceeded. People came forth of their houses. A great company of persons had gathered, and there were many women among them, drawn together by the strange curiosity which it is felt to see those who are about to die. These women, without special sympathy with Jesus as a religious teacher, but having their womanly compassion stirred by seeing the sufferings of a man whose appearance contrasted with that of the robbers, who were also carrying their crosses, at the place of crucifixion, broke out into bewailing lamentations. It was a touch of nature. The men were all against him. The temper of the mob was opposed to any pity for him. These women did not love him as tenderly as Mary of Bethany, as passionately as Mary of Magdala, but they were women, and women instinctively know the true man, and they wept. Well, do they? How many serial killers do we see that people think they're innocent? They get all sorts of fanfare from some women and other people. So, but there is women are more likely to think they have psychic powers. So, But again, it's what people do with their own beliefs and all that. It moved Jesus. It was the only incident on the way to the crucifixion which seems to have arrested his attention. He said nothing when he fell beneath the cross. He said nothing when they lifted it from his shoulders and gave it to Simon. But who can bear a woman's tears? Jesus turned and said to them, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For see, the days are coming in which they shall say, Happy are the barren, and the wombs that bear not, and the breasts that suckled not. Then shall they begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? The spirit of prophecy came upon him. He seemed to see what would occur on that spot 40 years afterwards. Touched by the womanly tribute of tears, he did not reject the proffered sympathy, but seemed to feel that he was gazing into the eyes of now happy young mothers whose old age should be crushed by a catastrophe of the most overwhelming character. He forgot his grief in theirs. Behold his cross and sepulchre. He saw the Roman investment of the holy city, the siege, the suffering, the horrors, starving mothers snatching food out of the mouths of their own children, and other starving mothers killing and roasting and eating their own offspring, while men and women and children went creeping through the subterranean passages and foulest sewers, and others fleeing hid themselves in the crevices of mountain rocks from the storm which was sweeping Jerusalem. This address to the women was the last utterance of a patriotism which came from the mouth of Jesus. He was then brought to a place which was called Golgotha in the Hebrew tongue, meaning skull. And they didn't call it Hebrew back then, but they called it Aramaic. Golgotha means skull, and the place is not called Cranion Topos, i.e. place of skulls, but Cranion, skull. Luke uses craniu. The word Calvary occurs in our authorized version only once. Luke 23:33. And there it is not a proper name in the original, but was adopted literally by our translators. The Hebrew Golgotha, the Greek Cranion, and the Latin Calvaria all mean the same thing, a skull. The site of the true Calvary has of late years been a subject of profound interest to topographers. At the present church of the Holy Sepulchre is over the place where Jesus died, as it is professed cannot be believed by those who examine the history and the spot free from the influence of tradition. Too much stress has been laid on the erection of a basilica on this spot in the early centuries. Churches may have been built to commemorate facts when there was no intent to designate sites, as we know that the Church of the Ascension, built by the Empress Helena, is not within sight of the spot from which Jesus ascended. We're on page 666, by the way. 603 is a, I go over that number quite a bit on this channel. I have a playlist for that. The true site must meet all the conditions of the history. These are 6, namely: 1, it was without the then existing walls of Jerusalem, Matthew 27:31 and 22, 28, verse 11, and Paul in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12. 2, it was near the city, John 19:20. 3, it was popularly known as the skull, Matthew 27:33, Mark 15:22, Luke 23:33, John 19:27. 4, it was near a gate leading to a leading thoroughfare, Matthew 27:39, Mark 15:29, Luke 23:26, 5. It was a conspicuous spot. Matthew 27:55, Mark 15:40, Luke 23:49, 6. It was near sepulchres and gardens. John 19:38-42. Not one of these propositions can be affirmed of the spot on which the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands, which is a low place inside the old walls, off the thoroughfares, and where no tombs would be allowed. All these 6 particulars meet in an elevation called the Grotto of Jeremiah. Remember, no J sound. Jeremiah, right? A short distance near the north of Damascus Gate. It is outside the city. It is near. It is conspicuously shaped like a skull, and from almost every point of view reminds the beholders of a skull. It is near what is still the entrance to the great thoroughfare from the north of Judea and all the upper Syria. It can be seen from almost every elevation about Jerusalem and looks down on hills that look down on the modern Church of the Sepulchre. According to Josephus, it was a place of tombs and gardens, and even now the number of rock tombs at this place and the extent of beauty of some of them impress the stranger with the wealth and splendor of the ancient Jewish capital. Dr. Porter's Handbook, Volume 1, page 93. See The True Site of Calvary by Mr. Fisher Howe. Published by A.D.F. Randolph and Co., New York, a capital treatise on this whole question containing much authority in support of the position taken in the text above. When they reached the spot before proceeding to crucify him, they offered him a drink composed of sour wine in which myrrh had been dissolved. There seems no proof that this was a Roman custom. Lightfoot quotes from the Talmud. To those that were to be executed, they gave a grain of myrrh infused in wine to drink, that their senses might be dulled. As it is said, give strong drink to them that are ready to die, and wine to those that are of a sorrowful heart. But this narcotic Jesus refused. He would have nothing to dim the clearness of his vision or enfeeble the vigor of his intellect. Then they crucified him. Now, see, that's one of the things. As an example, do you do drugs to ease or cover your the sense of your hardships, or do you do drugs to survive? If it's not for your survival, it is best to turn it away. Yeah, I know people are in pain and stuff like this, but long term, it catches up. And some of these painkillers actually kill people when people can live disabled without painkillers and live a longer life on average. Notably longer life, like a decade more or something. I think it was Section 10, from 9 o'clock to noon. So mid-morning to midday. They mean noon as in like the highest point of the day, right? Well, the highest point, the zenith of the sun for the day. Most places, because of daylight savings time, right, all that, you're talking about, most of the year, it's 1 something. It was now 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday the 7th of April. On each side of him was a thief crucified. It does not appear that Jesus was submitted to any torture beyond that which was inseparable from the crucifixion and beyond what the 2 thieves endured. His being crucified with them may have been intended as an indignity, but perhaps simply came to pass because it was customary to have executions at this feast. His disciples declared that, in fact, And that fact was a fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah 53:12. He was numbered with the transgressors. Not much of a prophecy because that would have happened yearly, while his executioners were performing their work. Jesus prayed for them. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It was touching and characteristic. He does not say, I forgive you. That would be to allude too distinctly to the wrongs he was suffering. He thought of their guilt, not his own sufferings. It was a prayer of pure unselfishness. Well, people could also say, well, it was a prayer that announced to people that I am in the right, they are in the wrong. I have knowledge about these things, and they're only acting out of some impulse. When they had set up the cross, they sat down to watch it, as their duty was. The usage was to crucify convicts naked, and the clothing fell to the executioners as a perquisite. Perquisite? Perquisite. Yeah. In the case, for some reason, anyway, in the case of Jesus, they had no difficulty with his outer garments, but they came to his inmost article of dress. They found it a strange fabric without a seam, woven throughout. It may have been the product of maternal love. It may have been the handiwork of the tender and loving Mary of Bethany, or the passionate Mary of Magdala. How little did love think, as love's fingers wove it, to what torture the precious body it was to cover should finally come. There was something about it which made even rude Roman soldiers pause. Well, trying to take away the dude's underwear was not cool, right? They determined not to tear it, and so cast lots. Again his disciples saw a prophecy fulfilled. In Psalm 22, verses 16 and 18, it is said, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. They part my garments among them and cast lots for my vesture. This, their loving hearts, applied to Jesus. Well, it was standard for people to, especially when someone was killed, to take the clothes as spoil, particularly if they didn't have the sense of modesty to do otherwise. When Pilate felt himself compelled to sentence Jesus, he made out the accusation on which he had condemned him. And this had probably been carried before Jesus and was now attached to the cross over his head. It was written in Hebrew and in Greek and in Latin, in the language of the populace, of the cultivated foreigners, and of the Roman officials. It was thus: Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The Roman judge thus decided that Jesus had no guilt, that nothing had been substantiated against him. For this, no crime. That his name should be Jesus. That he should either have been born or have lived in Nazareth. That he should have been literally or somehow figuratively a king of the Jews. It is the assertion of Caesar's government that Jesus was without crime. Personally, to Pilate, it was more. It was a gratification to be able to fling this slur in the faces of the persistent ecclesiastics who had coerced him. It is as if he had said, this poor forlorn peasant hanging on this cross is good enough king for these Jews. Or it might mean, they said they would have no king but Caesar. I crucify Jesus. If he be their king, he's a dead king, and the nails by which I fastened him on the cross bind them to the rejection of all kings but Caesar. The high priests were not slow to see this. They chose, notwithstanding their averment that they would have no king but Caesar, to leave that question open. They were very loyal ecclesiastics, and the history of the world shows how far such men are to be trusted. Pilate had no faith in them. They rushed back to his palace, where he must have sat moody over the events of the day, in which he had played so conspicuous and disagreeable a part. They called his attention to the character of the epigraph on the cross. They prayed him to change it, or at least so as to show that it was only a claim set up by Jesus. His surly answer was, "What I have written, I have written." With that, he dismissed them. Crucifixion was a tedious mode of execution. The soldiers took out their implements for gaming and sat down to play, while they kept guard over the crucified. At almost every public execution, there are displays of bitter feeling and outbreaks of grim humor. It is not a means of grace to see a fellow being tortured, however guilty. The cross was set up beside a thoroughfare. Those who passed by saw it. Some of these recollected what had been testified at the trial. So called, and he wagged his head and taunted Jesus, saying, "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, and come down from the cross." This reviling was not confined to the lower populace. The chief priests took it up, and probably walking in front of the cross or standing near enough for Jesus to hear, they said among themselves, not addressing him, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. If he be the Messiah, let him save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe on him. He trusted in God. Let him now deliver him, if he will, for he said, 'I am Son of God.'" Well, they're admitting that he's not God, first of all, but they also knew the phrase. So the phrase in that culture doesn't mean that you're literally a son of God, just like you're not literally a son of whatever prophet that you name. The spirit of reviling spread itself. The Roman soldiers, having no ecclesiastical bias and no theological views, began to echo the taunt of the populace and the priests. They offered him vinegar to drink. They mocked. They also said, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." That apparently forlorn and helpless peasant prophet on the cross made some contrast with Caesar's grandeur on the Palatine Hill in Rome, and with the barbaric splendor of some of the kings these soldiers had helped to conquer. The soldiers said to him directly, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." They would like to see him do it. It would be a marvel to see a man disengage himself from the cross. If he should attempt it, he would find Roman valor superior to any legerdemain or terrifying magic. If the Jews around these soldiers were not utterly obtuse, they must have felt that this insult reacted upon them in their civil and their ecclesiastical positions. These rude warriors from the Tiber were stamping out their state and their church in Jesus. Even one of the thieves, in the recklessness which often befalls men who are about to perish, began his raillery. "If you are the Messiah," said he, "save yourself and us, my comrade and myself." This man is a perplexing study. Nature calls for sympathy in behalf of the one who was in like sufferings with himself. He knew nothing against Jesus personally. If they had not been friends in life, they might have been friendly in death. The world was all against them both, but why should they not make common cause and, as far as possible, sustain each other in this last dark passage of their lives? But no, he turns upon him. He joins the mad crowd of persecutors. Is it that it was some relief to this man to have the tide of the public hate turned away from himself towards Jesus? Is it that we are always gratified to find that there are others more obnoxious than ourselves? Whatever the motive or the temper of the man, his conduct was another pain inflicted on Jesus. But the other robber was not so up to rate. He rebuked his comrade. Do you not fear God, seeing that you are in the same condemnation? And we, indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing amiss. He then turned his eyes towards Jesus and said, Jesus, remember me, when you shall come in your kingdom. Here was a marvelous confession. What this man could have known of Jesus prior to this time, we have now no means of learning. He may have known his whole history, and much as it had interested him, he had not until this moment been able to see in Jesus the sign of his being Israel's king. He may have been of that class of turbulent Jews who restlessly longed for the coming kingdom and the coming king, those Chiliasts who looked for 1,000 years of temporal glory to Israel and were not unwilling occasionally to make a blow at the Roman power, however futile that blow might be. In any event, he had seen Jesus coming forth to execution, had heard his prophecies to the daughters of Jerusalem, had heard his great prayer for his executioners, had regarded his bearing under the storm of abuse which had been poured upon him, had seen the superscription on the cross, had witnessed the intense excitement of the ecclesiastics, but after all, there are those things producing faith, which cannot be described. He believed in Jesus. Jesus did not repel his faith. He accepted it. The man had a sense of guilt and helplessness. He believed in the power of Jesus to save him somehow. He was so humble and modest that he did not interpret the suffering Jesus with the plea that he would help him now. He was willing to die for his offense against society, but he felt that Jesus was a royal personage and had a kingdom. He plaintively begged that when he began his reign, Jesus would not wholly forget his fellow sufferer in Golgotha. So, they know it's about the spiritual kingdom. The accents of the pleading came to Jesus amid the hisses and groans and taunts of the hateful uproar of his infuriated enemies. Jesus looked at the dying man and smoothed his rough passage to eternity with this reply, I assuredly say to you that you shall be with me in paradise today. What perfect confidence is here. What an assurance of power. What a claim over the future. What a pledge to another. He spoke as one to whom paradise belonged, who held the keys of the gardens of the future and immortality. Bound upon the cross, he ruled the spiritual world and pledged to meet his fellow sufferer on the hither side of the grave. Together on the cross, they should be together in happiness. There was no confusion of ideas here, no loss of confidence, no breakdown, no despair. He makes no reply to raillery, but has a quick, loving answer for faith. Now, there was a series of events, or a event where Muhammad likewise was able to tell people that, hey, you will get the paradise of the hereafter. And there was, 10 people? Jesus was not totally forsaken by his friends. The majority of the disciples had been scattered by the tragic events of the preceding night. Judas had betrayed him, and Peter had denied him, and the others had fled except John and the women. The beloved disciple came back. Love in him was stronger than terror. The women came in full force from the first, and through the morning all his acquaintance that had come from Galilee became sympathizing witnesses of his sufferings. Among the women are named his mother and his aunt, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, Salome, the mother of James and John and Mary of Magdala. There were many other women. These all stood afar. Modesty would have deterred a nearer approach to the naked person of the holy man, as they all so tenderly loved and greatly revered. And so they're implying that this was proof that Jesus was the ruler of these things, rather than As he said before in other places, my power is not my own power. My doctrine is not my own doctrine, but that of which sent me. And